The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan valley when Command first noticed something was wrong. Radio chatter had gone silent from grid reference 41S UB 12,340 567,890, where Captain Aurelius Ember, Kine's reconnaissance flight, should have been conducting routine surveillance. What they found instead would become the most documented military anomaly in modern warfare history. The U-60 Blackhawks approached the coordinates with standard tactical precision, their rotors beating against the thin mountain air. Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres, manning the door gun on the lead helicopter, had his finger ready on the trigger. Intel suggested possible enemy movement in the sector. What he saw through his scope made him freeze mid-breath. There, carved into the rocky outcropping overlooking the valley, was a symbol that made every aviator's blood run cold. The mark of Ember, three intersecting lines forming a triangle with a single dot at its center. It wasn't painted or scratched. It was burned into the stone itself, as if the rock had been branded by some impossible heat. "Control, this is Reaper 6, Tor's voice crackled over the radio, uncharacteristically hesitant. We've got the mark. Confirm visual on the mark of Ember." The response took longer than protocol demanded. When it came, the voice belonged to General Patricia Hawthorne herself, the Iron Lady of the 82nd Airborne. "Copy that, Reaper 6. Maintain distance. Do not repeat, do not engage. Switch to encrypted channel 7. The Black Hawks held their position, engines humming with barely contained power. Below them, the valley stretched endlessly, revealing no signs of life. But the mark burned in the morning light, a reminder of a story that officially didn't exist. Captain Aurelius Kine had been declared dead 6 months ago. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon had been shot down over these same mountains during a classified mission. The wreckage was never found. The body was never recovered. The official report stated, "Pilot error resulted in controlled flight into terrain. Case closed." But the mark of Ember had appeared 7 times since her supposed death. Each time, enemy positions that had been deemed impregnable were found abandoned, their weapons destroyed, their communications severed. Each time, that same impossible symbol was burned into nearby rock or metal, as if left by a ghost who refused to stay buried. The legend had started in the pilot briefing rooms, whispered between sorties. They called her the Phoenix of the Hindu Kush, the burned angel, the ghost of Grid 41. But to those who knew her before the crash, she was simply Ember, the most skilled pilot anyone had ever seen, and the most misunderstood. Staff Sergeant Torres adjusted his headset, his eyes never leaving the mark. He'd heard the stories, dismissed them as combat stress and wishful thinking. But now, staring at that symbol burned into solid rock, he began to understand that some legends were built on truth. The radio crackled again. "Reaper 6, this is Control. We're sending you the classified file. It's time you knew the real story." The morning sun climbed higher, casting the mark of Ember in sharp relief against the ancient stone. And somewhere in the mountains below, Captain Aurelius Kine was very much alive, watching through crosshairs as the Black Hawks held their distance, finally showing the respect she'd earned through 6 months of impossible warfare. The file that came through the encrypted channel would change everything the rescue team thought they knew about their mission. Because finding Captain Aurelius Kine wasn't about bringing home a lost pilot. It was about retrieving a weapon of war that had learned to think for itself. Her call sign wasn't just Ember because of her red hair or her fiery temperament. It was because she left everything she touched burned beyond recognition, including the very definition of what one pilot could accomplish against impossible odds. The Black Hawks maintained their distance, rotors beating against the mountain air, while below them, the greatest military mind of her generation prepared for a war that only she could see coming. The mark of Ember wasn't just a symbol, it was a declaration. And today, Command would finally understand what they'd unleashed when they declared Captain Aurelius Kine dead. But first, they had to survive long enough to hear her story. Captain Aurelius Kine had always been different. While other pilots relied on instruments and training, she seemed to have an almost supernatural understanding of the sky itself. Her instructors at the Air Force Academy had called her intuitive to a fault, which was military speak for brilliant but insubordinate. She graduated third in her class, not because she lacked skill, but because she refused to follow conventional wisdom when her instincts said otherwise. The Academy records showed a pattern of minor infractions, unauthorized low-level flights, creative interpretations of engagement rules, and a disturbing tendency to achieve mission objectives through methods that made her superiors uncomfortable. Her flight instructors noted that she seemed to anticipate threats before they appeared on radar, execute maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible, and land aircraft that should have been declared unflyable. Major Rebecca Santos, who'd been Kine's commanding officer at Bagram Airfield, remembered the first time she'd seen Ember fly. She didn't just pilot the aircraft, Santos would later testify in the classified hearing. She became part of it. I watched her land an F-16 with significant hydraulic damage in conditions that should have been impossible. The plane was barely responding to controls, but she brought it down like she was conducting a symphony. The nickname Ember had come from her habit of pushing aircraft beyond their operational limits. While other pilots bobbied their engines, Kine would coax maximum performance from every system, leaving maintenance crews to joke that her planes ran so hot they might spontaneously combust. The name stuck, though few understood its deeper meaning. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the combat psychologist who'd evaluated Kine after a particularly controversial mission, had written in her report, "Captain Kine displays an unusual relationship with risk assessment. Where most pilots calculate odds and adjust behavior accordingly, she seems to operate on a different mathematical model entirely. Her success rate suggests either extraordinary luck or an understanding of combat dynamics that transcends conventional training." The controversial mission that had led to that evaluation involved a search and rescue operation deep in Taliban territory. Intelligence had indicated that a special forces team was pinned down in a valley with no feasible extraction route. The terrain was too rough for helicopters, the enemy presence too heavy for ground assault. Command had written off the team as lost. Captain Kine had requested permission to attempt an extraction flight. Her plan involved flying an F-16 at near ground level through a canyon system, dropping precision-guided munitions to clear a landing zone, then somehow extracting the team. The plan was deemed tactically unsound and operationally impossible by 3 different review boards. She'd launched anyway. The mission footage, recorded by her helmet camera and later classified at the highest levels, showed Kine threading her F-16 through canyon walls with less than 50 feet of clearance on either side. She'd navigated by visual reference alone, her instruments useless in the narrow confines. The precision with which she'd placed her ordnance had cleared exactly enough space for a helicopter extraction, which she'd called in before completing her run. 6 Special Forces operators came home that day because Captain Aurelius Kine had redefined what was possible in the cockpit of an F-16. The official report credited innovative tactical thinking and exceptional piloting skills. Unofficially, her superiors began to understand that they had something unprecedented on their hands. The problem was that exceptional abilities came with exceptional independence. Kine had a habit of interpreting orders creatively, of finding solutions that worked but didn't follow established doctrine. Her mission success rate was unprecedented, but her methods made command nervous. She was exactly the kind of pilot they needed, and exactly the kind of pilot they didn't know how to control. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed a woman who understood warfare at a level that transcended conventional thinking. Dr. Vasquez noted that Kine seemed to view each mission as part of a larger strategic puzzle, making decisions based on factors that wouldn't become apparent until weeks or months later. It was as if she could see the entire chessboard while everyone else was focused on individual pieces. The Blackhawks hovering over the mark of Ember carried officers who were about to learn that Captain Aurelius Kine hadn't died in that crash 6 months ago. She'd evolved. The woman who'd once pushed the boundaries of what an F-16 could do had spent half a year learning what a human being could accomplish when stripped of everything except pure will and an impossible understanding of war itself. Staff Sergeant Torres studied the classified files streaming across his display, his understanding of the mission changing with every paragraph. They weren't here to rescue a pilot. They were here to find a force of nature that had been unleashed on the Afghan mountains and somehow convince her to come home. The encrypted communication from General Hawthorne carried a tone that Torres had never heard before. Reaper 6, you need to understand. Captain Kine isn't just a missing pilot. She's been conducting an unauthorized war for 6 months. Every Taliban stronghold in this region has been systematically destroyed. Not by airstrikes, not by ground forces. By one woman with nothing but her training and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The file continued streaming data. Surveillance photos showed impossible infiltration routes, destroyed weapons caches, and always, the mark of Ember burned into whatever material was available. Metal, stone, concrete. The mark appeared burned at temperatures that should have been impossible to generate with field equipment. Tor's weapons officer, Sergeant Kim Nakamura, leaned over his shoulder to read the file. "Sir, this has to be exaggerated. One person couldn't do all this." The radio crackled with General Hawthorne's voice. "Sergeant, I want you to look at grid reference 41 SUB 11,055,000. Tell me what you see." Torres adjusted his scope and swept the coordinates. What he found made him question everything he'd learned about warfare. A Taliban training camp that intelligence had rated as heavily fortified lay in perfect ruins. Not bombed, dismantled. Guard towers had been toppled with surgical precision. Weapons depots had been destroyed from within. Communication arrays had been methodically torn apart. And there, burned into the concrete of the main building, was the mark of Ember. "This is impossible," Nakamura whispered. "The intelligence report said this place had over 200 fighters." Had, Torres corrected, his respect for the missing pilot growing with each piece of evidence. Past tense. The radio brought General Hawthorne's voice again, heavy with implications. "Reaper 6, that's the 7th installation Captain Kine has neutralized. Each one planned and executed with precision that our best special forces teams couldn't match. She's been operating alone, on foot, with no support except what she can scavenge from the enemy." The scope revealed more details. The destruction wasn't random, it was strategic. Every piece of equipment that could be used to threaten American forces had been systematically destroyed. Every position that could provide overwatch on convoy routes had been eliminated. The missing pilot had been conducting her own private war, and she was winning. Torres felt the weight of realization settling on his shoulders. The woman they'd been sent to rescue had become something unprecedented in military history. She wasn't hiding from the enemy, she was hunting them. "Control, this is Reaper 6. What are our actual orders regarding Captain Kine?" The pause before General Hawthorne's response spoke volumes. "Your orders are to make contact and assess her condition. Do not attempt to extract her unless she agrees to extraction. Do not engage in any actions that might be construed as hostile." And Sergeant Torres. "Yes, ma'am. Remember that you're dealing with someone who has been conducting successful combat operations for 6 months with no support, no resupply, and no backup. Show appropriate respect." The morning sun climbed higher, casting the mark of Ember in sharp relief. Somewhere in the mountains below, Captain Aurelius Kine was watching them, deciding whether they were friends or just another problem to solve. The Blackhawks held their position, engines humming with barely contained power, while their crews began to understand that the mission had changed fundamentally. They weren't here to rescue a pilot. They were here to negotiate with a force of nature that had learned to make war with nothing but will and an understanding of combat that transcended everything they'd been taught about what was possible. The radio crackled one final time. Reaper 6, be advised that Captain Kine is likely monitoring this frequency. Whatever you say next, remember that she's been listening to everything we've discussed. The next move is hers. The scope revealed movement in the rocks below. A figure in desert camouflage, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had become part of the landscape itself. Captain Aurelius Kine was making herself known, and Tors realized that everything they thought they knew about warfare was about to change forever. The figure in the rocks below moved with a precision that spoke of months spent becoming one with the terrain. Staff Sergeant Tors tracked her through his scope, nodding the way she seemed to flow between shadows, using every depression and outcropping for concealment. This wasn't the movement of a desperate survivor. This was the calculated advance of someone who had mastered the art of mountain warfare. "Movement 2 o'clock, Tors reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Single individual approximately 800 meters. Definitely human, definitely tactical." The figure stopped at a position that provided perfect overwatch of the Blackhawk's position. Through his scope, Tors could see the glint of optical equipment. She was studying them with the same intensity they were studying her. For a moment, hunter and hunted regarded each other across the mountain air, each calculating possibilities. Captain Aurelius Kine had chosen her position with mathematical precision. The rocky outcropping provided cover from multiple angles while offering clear fields of fire toward the helicopters. More importantly, it was positioned so that the mark of Ember was clearly visible between her location and the Blackhawks, a deliberate reminder of what she'd accomplished. "She's been watching us since we arrived," Sergeant Nakamura observed, adjusting her own optics. "Probably cataloged every weapon system, every potential threat, every escape route." Tors nodded, beginning to understand the depth of tactical thinking they were dealing with. The missing pilot hadn't simply survived in these mountains, she'd claimed them. Every sight line, every natural fortification, every possible approach route had been mapped and prepared. They were operating in her domain now, by her rules. The radio crackled with an unfamiliar voice, female, calm, and carrying the particular authority that came from someone who had learned to command through action rather than rank. "Reaper 6, this is Ember. I assume you're here about the installations I've been redecorating." The voice carried no stress, no indication of someone who had been living rough for 6 months. If anything, she sounded more confident, more focused than the pilot voices Tors was accustomed to hearing over the radio. This was the voice of someone who had found their element. "Ember, this is Reaper 6. We're here to assess your condition and discuss extraction. Command is concerned about your welfare." The laugh that came through the radio was rich with dark humor. "My welfare? Interesting. I assume Command has been monitoring my activities through satellite imagery. What's their assessment of my welfare based on the evidence?" Tors glanced at the classified file still streaming across his display. 7 Taliban installations destroyed, enemy communications disrupted across 50 square kilometers, and not a single American casualty in the sector for 3 months. The evidence suggested that Captain Kine's welfare was significantly better than anyone had imagined. "Your operational success has been noted," Tors replied carefully. "Command would like to discuss your methods and future operations." Future operations. The voice carried a tone that suggested she was considering possibilities that hadn't occurred to anyone else. "Tell me, Sergeant, what does Command think about the strategic situation in this sector?" The question caught Tors off guard. He was here to extract a pilot, not conduct a strategic assessment. but the way she asked suggested that she saw patterns that others had missed, connections that extended beyond individual missions. I'm not briefed on strategic assessments, Ember. My mission is limited to establishing contact and evaluating your status. Of course it is. The voice carried a note of disappointment that somehow made Tors feel like he'd failed a test he didn't know he was taking. Sergeant, are you familiar with the concept of systemic warfare? Tors exchanged glances with his crew. The term wasn't part of standard military doctrine, but the way she said it suggested she was operating from a theoretical framework that transcended conventional tactics. Negative, Ember, please clarify. Systemic warfare is the practice of identifying and disrupting the underlying systems that enable enemy operations. Rather than engaging individual units, you target the infrastructure, communication networks, and supply chains that make organized resistance possible. As she spoke, Tors began to understand the pattern behind the destroyed installations. Each one had been a node in a larger network, a critical component in the Taliban's operational capacity. By systematically eliminating these nodes, she'd effectively paralyzed enemy operations across the entire region. The installations you've been monitoring weren't random targets, she continued. They were the nervous system of enemy operations in this sector. Remove the right components, and the entire organism becomes non-functional. The tactical brilliance of her approach was becoming clear. While conventional forces focused on eliminating individual threats, she'd been conducting warfare at a systems level, targeting the connections that made organized resistance possible. It was a kind of strategic thinking that belonged in graduate-level military theory, not in the field operations of a single pilot. Ember, that's impressive tactical analysis. Command would like to discuss your insights in a more formal setting. Would they? The voice carried a skepticism that cut through military politeness. Or are they concerned about a pilot who's been conducting unauthorized operations for 6 months? The question forced Tors to confront the reality of the situation. Command wasn't just interested in Captain Kine's tactical insights. They were concerned about a military asset that had been operating completely outside the chain of command, achieving results that formal operations hadn't been able to match. Command's primary concern is bringing you home safely, Tors replied, though the words felt inadequate as he spoke them. Home. The word carried a weight that suggested she'd been thinking about its meaning for months. Tell me, Sergeant, where exactly is home for someone who's learned to see warfare as a system rather than a series of individual battles? The question hung in the mountain air, heavy with implications. Through his scope, Tors could see that she hadn't moved from her position, but somehow her presence felt larger, more significant. This wasn't just a missing pilot. This was someone who had evolved beyond the constraints of conventional military thinking. The radio crackled again. I'm going to ask you a question, Reaper 6, and I want you to consider your answer carefully. In the 6 months since my aircraft went down, how many American casualties have occurred in this sector? Tors accessed the casualty reports through his tactical display. The numbers were startling. 0, Ember. No American casualties reported in this sector for 96 days. And in the 6 months before my arrival in this sector, the contrast was stark. 43 casualties, including 12 KIA. So my unauthorized operations have created a 43% improvement in American survival rates. Now, tell me why Command considers this problematic. The logic was undeniable, and Tors found himself questioning the assumptions behind his mission. A pilot who had been declared dead was conducting warfare more effectively than formal operations, protecting American lives through methods that Command couldn't understand or control. Ember, Command recognizes your success. They want to incorporate your insights into official operations. Incorporate. The word carried a kind of sad understanding. They want to take what I've learned and filter it through committees and doctrine and rules of engagement that will reduce its effectiveness to acceptable levels. She was right, and Torres knew it. Military bureaucracy had a way of turning innovation into doctrine, of making exceptional actions into routine procedures that lost their power through systematization. What Captain Kine had accomplished couldn't be replicated through formal channels. What are you proposing, Ember? I'm proposing that some problems require solutions that exist outside conventional frameworks. The Taliban in this region operate through systems that formal military operations can't effectively target. But one person, operating with complete tactical flexibility, can disrupt those systems in ways that traditional forces cannot. The radio fell silent, and Torres realized that they were no longer discussing a rescue mission. They were discussing a fundamental question about the nature of warfare itself, about what could be accomplished when exceptional individuals were given the freedom to operate beyond conventional constraints. Through his scope, he could see that Captain Aurelius Kine was still watching them, still calculating possibilities. But now he understood that she wasn't just a missing pilot. She was a military theorist who had turned the Afghan mountains into her laboratory, developing new forms of warfare that challenged everything command thought they knew about combat operations. The mark of Ember burned in the mountain sun, a symbol of possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional military thinking. And somewhere in the rocks below, Captain Aurelius Kine was waiting to see if command had the courage to embrace solutions that transcended the comfortable limitations of doctrine. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the valley, and Torres began to understand that his mission had evolved into something unprecedented. He wasn't just in contact with a missing pilot, he was negotiating with the future of warfare itself. The silence stretched between the Blackhawks and the mountainside, heavy with implications that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Staff Sergeant Torres found himself caught between his orders and a growing realization that conventional military thinking was inadequate to address what Captain Kine had become. Reaper 6, this is control. General Hawthorne's voice cut through the radio frequency with the authority of someone who had made difficult decisions for 30 years. What's your assessment of Captain Kine's tactical and psychological condition? Torres studied the figure in the rocks below, noting the way she had positioned herself to control the entire conversation while maintaining multiple escape routes. Her radio discipline was perfect, her tactical awareness absolute, and her strategic thinking beyond anything he'd encountered in 15 years of military service. Control, subject appears to be in excellent tactical condition. Her strategic analysis suggests advanced understanding of asymmetric warfare. Psychological condition appears stable and focused. Request clarification on extraction protocols. Ember, this is Control. General Hawthorne speaking. I'd like to discuss your operational parameters directly. The response came immediately, with the crisp professionalism that suggested Captain Kine had been expecting this moment. General, I assume you've reviewed the tactical assessment of my activities. What's your evaluation of their strategic impact? Your tactical success is undeniable, Captain. Your methods are what concern command. Operating without authorization, without support, without oversight. These actions fall outside acceptable parameters for military operations. Acceptable parameters. The words carried a weight that suggested she'd been thinking about this concept for months. General, are you familiar with the casualty statistics for this sector before and after my arrival? I am, and I'm also familiar with the risks you've been taking. Captain, you've been conducting operations that should require a full Special Forces team, with no backup, no support, and no extraction plan. The fact that you've succeeded doesn't make the risks acceptable. Through his scope, Torres could see Captain Kine shift slightly, a movement that suggested she was considering her response with the same tactical precision she applied to everything else. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular authority that came from someone who had tested their theories against reality and found them sound. "General, I want you to consider a theoretical scenario. Suppose you have a pilot who understands warfare at a systems level, who can operate with complete tactical flexibility, who can achieve strategic objectives that conventional forces cannot match. What do you do with that pilot?" The question struck at the heart of military bureaucracy's fundamental challenge. How do you manage exceptional individuals whose abilities transcend conventional frameworks? How do you incorporate innovation that challenges established doctrine? Captain, exceptional individuals operate within established chains of command. Your skills are valuable, but they must be applied through proper channels. Proper channels. The words carried a kind of sad understanding. "General, in the 6 months I've been operating in this sector, I've neutralized more enemy capabilities than formal operations accomplished in the previous 2 years. I've done it with 0 American casualties, 0 civilian casualties, and minimal resource expenditure. Now explain to me why proper channels are more important than results." The logic was undeniable, and Torres found himself questioning the assumptions that governed military operations. Captain Kine had achieved unprecedented tactical success through methods that couldn't be replicated within conventional frameworks. The question was whether command had the courage to acknowledge that some problems required solution that existed outside established doctrine. "Captain, the issue isn't your results. The issue is accountability. Military operations require oversight, coordination, and integration with broader strategic objectives. Individual actions, however successful, cannot exist in isolation from command structure." Command structure. The voice carried a note of bitter experience. "General, I've been monitoring military communications for 6 months. I've watched conventional operations struggle with problems that individual initiative could solve immediately. The command structure you're defending is the same structure that declared me dead, rather than acknowledging that unconventional methods might achieve superior results." The accusation hung in the mountain air, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about military bureaucracy. Captain Kine had been declared dead not because of evidence, but because accepting her survival would have required acknowledging that individual innovation could outperform institutional operations. "Captain, I understand your frustration, but military organizations exist to coordinate individual efforts toward collective objectives. Your tactical success doesn't invalidate the need for institutional structure." Doesn't it? The question carried a challenge that went beyond individual circumstances. "General, I want you to consider what I've accomplished with no support, no authorization, and no resources beyond what I could acquire from the enemy. Now imagine what could be accomplished if exceptional individuals were given the freedom to operate at their full potential." The radio fell silent as everyone processed the implications of her words. Captain Kine wasn't just advocating for individual autonomy. She was proposing a fundamental restructuring of how military operations were conceived and executed. Torres found himself caught between two worldviews: the institutional perspective that valued order, coordination, and predictable results, and the individual perspective that valued innovation, adaptation, and exceptional achievement. Both had merit, but they seemed fundamentally incompatible. "Captain, what are you proposing specifically?" "I'm proposing that some problems require solutions that exist outside conventional frameworks. The Taliban in this region operate through networks that formal military operations cannot effectively target. But individuals with tactical flexibility and strategic understanding can disrupt those networks in ways that traditional forces cannot." The proposal was radical, suggesting a form of warfare that combined individual initiative with institutional resources. It challenged the fundamental assumptions about military organization while acknowledging the reality of what Captain Kine had accomplished. Captain, that level of operational autonomy would require unprecedented trust from command. How do we ensure that individual operations align with broader strategic objectives? The same way you ensure that conventional operations align with strategic objectives. You select individuals with proven judgment, you provide clear strategic guidance, and you evaluate results. The difference is that you give those individuals the tactical flexibility to achieve objectives through methods that conventional forces cannot employ. Tours realized that they were no longer discussing a rescue mission. They were discussing the future of military operations, the possibility of combining individual excellence with institutional support to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. The mark of Ember burned in the mountain sun, a symbol of possibilities that challenged everything command thought they knew about warfare. And somewhere in the rocks below, Captain Aurelius Kine was waiting to see if the military establishment had the courage to embrace solutions that transcended the comfortable limitations of doctrine. The morning sun climbed higher, and Torres began to understand that his mission had evolved into something unprecedented. He wasn't just in contact with a missing pilot. He was witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare that could change everything about how military operations were conceived and executed. The radio crackled again, and General Hawthorne's voice carried a note of resignation that suggested she was wrestling with possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate situation. "Captain, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Are you willing to return to conventional operations, or do you intend to continue operating independently?" The question forced everyone to confront the reality of the situation. Captain Kine had demonstrated that individual initiative could achieve results that institutional operations couldn't match. The question was whether the military establishment could adapt to incorporate that reality, or whether it would continue to prioritize institutional control over tactical effectiveness. Through his scope, Torres could see that Captain Kine had not moved from her position, but somehow her presence felt larger, more significant. This wasn't just a missing pilot. This was someone who had evolved beyond the constraints of conventional military thinking, someone who had discovered possibilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. The response, when it came, would determine not just the fate of Captain Aurelius Kine, but the future of military operations in an era where individual excellence could achieve results that institutional efforts could not match. The radio silence stretched longer than protocol normally allowed, and Torres could feel the weight of decision hanging in the mountain air. When Captain Kine finally spoke, her voice carried the measured tone of someone who had spent months considering this exact moment. "General, I'm going to tell you something that isn't in any official report. When my aircraft went down, I had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to follow emergency protocols or trust my tactical instincts. Emergency protocols would have led me to a predetermined extraction point where enemy forces were waiting. My instincts told me to disappear into the mountains and conduct individual reconnaissance of enemy capabilities." She paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing. "I chose to trust my instincts. That choice saved my life and led to the systematic disruption of enemy operations across this entire sector. Now you're asking me to abandon the tactical flexibility that enabled that success and return to a system that would have got me killed." Torres felt the logic of her position settling into his understanding. The conventional military system that General Hawthorne was defending was the same system that had provided intelligence suggesting the extraction point was safe when it was actually compromised. Captain Kine's survival and subsequent success had resulted from her willingness to operate outside that system. "Captain, I understand your position, but individual operations, however successful, cannot exist in isolation from coordinated military efforts. Your tactical success is valuable, but it must be integrated with broader strategic objectives. Integrated. The word carried a skepticism that suggested she'd been thinking about this concept for months. General, I want you to consider what integration means in practical terms. It means committee reviews of tactical decisions, rules of engagement that prioritize political considerations over tactical effectiveness, and resource allocation systems that can't respond to rapidly changing circumstances. The criticism was pointed and accurate. Tours had seen enough military bureaucracy to know that integration often meant reducing innovation to acceptable levels, filtering tactical flexibility through institutional constraints that diminished its effectiveness. Captain, those constraints exist to ensure that individual actions align with collective objectives. Military operations require coordination to prevent friendly fire incidents, resource conflicts, and strategic contradictions. Do they? The question carried a challenge that went beyond individual circumstances. General, in 6 months of independent operations, I've had 0 friendly fire incidents, 0 resource conflicts with other units, and 0 strategic contradictions with stated objectives. I've achieved these results precisely because I've been operating outside the coordination systems that create those problems. The radio fell silent as everyone processed the implications of her words. Captain Kine was arguing that individual excellence, given appropriate freedom, could achieve better coordination than institutional systems designed to enforce coordination through rigid protocols. Tours found himself questioning assumptions he'd held for his entire military career. The coordination systems that General Hawthorne was defending were the same systems that had led to the intelligence failures, resource conflicts, and strategic contradictions that had made Captain Kine's independent operations necessary. Captain, what are you proposing as an alternative to established command structures? I'm proposing that exceptional individuals be given the resources and authority to operate at their full potential, not as isolated agents, but as autonomous units within a broader strategic framework. Give them clear objectives, appropriate support, and the tactical flexibility to achieve results that conventional forces cannot match. The proposal was radical, suggesting a form of military organization that combined individual initiative with institutional support. It challenged the fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy while acknowledging the reality of what exceptional individuals could accomplish given appropriate freedom. Captain, that level of autonomy would require unprecedented trust from command. How do we ensure that autonomous operations align with broader strategic objectives? The same way you ensure that conventional operations align with strategic objectives. You select individuals with proven judgment, you provide clear strategic guidance, and you evaluate results based on achievement rather than compliance with procedures. Tours realized that they were discussing a fundamental question about the nature of military effectiveness. Was the military more effective when it prioritized institutional control and predictable procedures, or when it empowered exceptional individuals to achieve results through methods that conventional forces couldn't employ? The mark of Ember burned in the mountain sun, a symbol of possibilities that challenged everything command thought they knew about warfare. Captain Kine had proven that individual excellence could achieve results that institutional operations couldn't match. The question was whether the military establishment had the courage to embrace that reality. General, I want you to consider the strategic implications of what I've accomplished. 7 enemy installations neutralized, communication networks disrupted, supply chains severed, and operational capacity reduced to negligible levels. I've achieved these results with 0 American casualties, 0 civilian casualties, and minimal resource expenditure. Now tell me why institutional coordination is more important than those results. The logic was undeniable, and Tours could feel the weight of decision settling on everyone involved. Captain Kine had demonstrated that individual initiative could achieve unprecedented tactical success. The question was whether command had the courage to acknowledge that some problems required solutions that existed outside conventional frameworks. Captain, I'm going to be direct with you. Your tactical success is remarkable, but your methods challenge the fundamental assumptions about military operations. If we acknowledge that individual initiative can outperform institutional operations, we're acknowledging that our entire approach to warfare may be flawed. Yes, the word carried a finality that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to articulate this reality. General, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. Our approach to warfare is flawed because it prioritizes institutional control over tactical effectiveness, procedure over results, and predictable mediocrity over exceptional achievement. The accusation hung in the mountain air, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about military bureaucracy. Captain Kine was arguing that the military establishment itself was the primary obstacle to achieving the results that individual excellence could provide. Captain, what you're describing would require a fundamental restructuring of military operations. That's not something that can be accomplished through individual initiative. Isn't it? The question carried a challenge that went beyond immediate circumstances. General, I've been conducting a fundamental restructuring of military operations in this sector for 6 months. I've proven that exceptional individuals can achieve results that institutional operations cannot match. The question is whether command has the courage to acknowledge that reality and adapt accordingly. The radio crackled with General Hawthorne's voice, carrying a note of resignation that suggested she was wrestling with possibilities that extended far beyond her ability to control. Captain, I'm going to ask you one final question. Are you willing to return to conventional operations, or do you intend to continue operating independently? Through his scope, Torres could see